My parents smiled and announced baby number 20, but nobody knew that in the next 10 minutes I would expose every dark secret, stand up to my neglectful parents, grab my bags, and walk out forever, never to return. I had packed the bags 3 weeks before that dinner. That is the first thing you need to know. This was not impulsive. This was not a moment where something snapped and I acted without thinking and then had to live with the consequences of a single bad decision. I had thought about it for years. I had rehearsed it in my head across hundreds of nights, lying in a bedroom I shared with 4 other children, listening to the sounds of a house that was always too full and never full in the right way. I had written versions of what I wanted to say in notebooks I kept hidden under the loose floorboard beside my bed, because privacy in my house was not a right, it was something you constructed in secret and defended silently. I had planned this with the careful patience of someone who understood that the only way out was through, and that through required timing. The timing arrived on a Thursday evening in November when my parents sat 14 of their children around a table that was never quite large enough, and my mother folded her hands and smiled the specific smile she wore when she was about to say something she expected everyone to celebrate, and announced that she was pregnant with their 20th child. And in the 10 minutes that followed, I became someone my family had never seen before. Not because I lost control. Because I finally used it. I'm the 7th of what was, at that moment, 19 children. I want you to sit with that number for a moment before I continue. 19. My parents had been having children for 26 years without interruption, without apparent reflection, without any visible consideration of what it meant to bring a human being into a home that was already stretched beyond every reasonable limit. We lived in a house that had been built for a family of 6. We ate in shifts. We wore clothing in a rotation system that my older sisters managed because my parents had long since stopped being able to track who needed what. The older children raised the younger ones. That was not a temporary arrangement or an occasional helping hand. That was the structure. That was the actual operational reality of our household. My parents provided the pregnancy and the announcement, and the religious conviction that each child was a blessing. The actual raising was distributed among the children who were old enough to do it, which meant that by the time I was 9 I was responsible for 2 children younger than me, and by the time I was 12 I was responsible for 4. My parents were not cruel in the way that word usually means. My father did not raise his hand to us. My mother did not say things designed to wound. They were, in their own understanding of themselves, devoted. Devoted to their faith, which told them that children were gifts and that limiting those gifts was a moral failure. Devoted to each other, in the specific way of 2 people who have built an entire identity around a shared project and cannot afford to examine the project too closely because the examination would require them to confront things they have decided not to see. They smiled at every announcement. They cried at every birth. And then the baby came home and the older children absorbed it into the rotation, and my parents moved on to the next pregnancy with the momentum of people who have never been required to fully reckon with the consequences of the previous one. The consequences were us. The consequences were 19 children, soon to be 20, in various states of need that were being met not by the 2 at LTS who had chosen to create those needs but by the children themselves, the older ones carrying the younger ones, everyone carrying everyone, the whole system running on a kind of desperate cooperative labor that looked, from the outside, like a large cheerful family and felt, from the inside, like being responsible for everything and credited for nothing. I was the one who noticed the things that fell through the cracks. I was the one who realized, when my brother Caleb was 7, that he could not read at the level he should have been able to read, and that nobody had addressed it because there were simply too many children for anyone to track individual developmental needs with any precision. I was the one who found out, when my sister Maya was 9, that she had been being treated badly by an older child in the neighborhood for months and had not told our parents because she had learned, the way all of us had learned, that bringing a problem to our parents was unlikely to produce a solution and was more likely to produce a conversation about patience and faith and trusting that things would work out. I was the one who sat with Maya through that. I was the one who figured out Caleb's reading. I was the one who managed the medication schedule for the 3 younger children who had various health needs. I was the one who noticed when the food was running low before my parents did, who tracked the clothing rotation, who kept a list of which child had which school obligation on which day. I was 17 years old and I was running a household that 2 at LTS had created and declined to fully manage. I want to be precise about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am not saying my parents never loved us. I believe they loved us in the way people love things they have decided are meaningful without fully understanding the weight of what that meaning requires. I am not saying every moment of my childhood was suffering. There were moments of genuine warmth, specific memories I carry that are not complicated. I am saying that the system they had built was one in which their choices were celebrated and their children's labor was invisible, and that the invisibility of that labor was not accidental. It was structural. It was the thing the whole arrangement depended on. By the time I was 16, I had started researching. Quietly, on the library computer during the 2 hours a week I had that were genuinely my own time. I researched family welfare organizations. I researched what legal protections existed for children in overcrowded households. I researched what documentation would be needed and what thresholds had to be crossed before any external body would consider intervening. I was not planning to report my parents. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the shape of what I eventually did. I was planning to leave. I was building a picture of what leaving required and what it made possible. I was learning, methodically and privately, what my options were. By 17, I had a plan. I had saved money from the small amounts I had accumulated over years of birthdays and occasional paid work for neighbors. I had made contact, carefully, with an older cousin who had left our extended family circle years earlier and lived 3 states away and had, when I reached out, responded with an immediacy and warmth that told me she had been waiting for exactly this kind of contact. I had a place to go. I had enough money for a bus ticket with some remaining. I had a bag packed with everything that was mine and nothing that was not. I had kept that bag under my bed for 3 weeks, ready, waiting for the right moment. The right moment arrived on a Thursday in November. My mother's announcement landed on the table the way her announcements always landed, with expectation of joy, with a slight forward lean of someone waiting to be celebrated. Several of my younger siblings reacted with genuine excitement because they were young enough that a new baby still felt like an event rather than an addition to an already impossible load. My father smiled his broad smile and looked around the table the way he always did at these moments, collecting the reactions, confirming the family's shared happiness. I looked at my sister Leah, who was 15 and had been managing the night routine for the 4 youngest children for 8 months. I looked at my brother Daniel, who was 13 and had quietly stopped doing his own homework because he was spending his evenings helping the younger ones with theirs. I looked at Maya, who was 12 now, 3 years past the thing that had happened in the neighborhood, still carrying something in her eyes that had not been there before it. I looked at Caleb, who could read now, because I had spent 2 years working on it with him, not because anyone had asked me to but because nobody else was going to. I looked at all of them and I felt something that I had been managing for years finally become unmanageable. I stood up. My father stopped smiling first. The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when something outside the expected script has occurred. My mother looked at me with an expression that was still partially celebratory, still expecting me to fold back into the moment, still not reading what was on my face correctly. I said, "I need to say something." My father said my name. The warning in it was clear. I said, "Leah has been putting 4 children to bed every night for 8 months. She is 15. Daniel stopped doing his own schoolwork because he is spending his evenings doing yours. Maya needed help 3 years ago and she did not come to you because she already knew it would not produce anything useful. Caleb could not read at 7 and it took me 2 years to fix it because nobody else noticed. I have been managing the medication schedule for 3 children for 14 months. I track the food. I track the clothing. I track who needs to be where and when. I have been doing this since I was 12 years old and I am 17 now and you are announcing a 20th child and I need you to understand, clearly, in front of everyone at this table, what that announcement means to the people sitting here." The silence was total. My mother said, very quietly, "This is not the time." I said, "It is exactly the time. It has always been the time. We have just never been allowed to say so." My father stood. His face had moved past surprise into something I had not seen directed at me before, a controlled anger that was working hard to remain controlled. He said that I was being disrespectful. He said that this family was a blessing and that I was taking something sacred and turning it into an accusation. He said that everything that had been done in this house had been done with love and that I was too young and too selfish to understand what that meant. I had expected this. I had rehearsed this exact response in my head across hundreds of nights. So I did not react to it emotionally. I looked at my father and I said, calmly, "I am not too young. I have been an adult in this house since I was 12. The difference is that you never had to become one." My mother made a sound I had not heard from her before. I walked to the hallway. I came back with a bag. I had left it just outside the dining room door when I came down for dinner, because I had known, with the certainty of someone who has planned something for 3 weeks, that this was the night. I set the bag on the floor beside my chair. I looked at my siblings, the ones old enough to understand what was happening, and I said, "You do not have to stay in something that was never your responsibility to carry. There are people who will help you. I'm going to be one of them." My father said my name again. This time the warning had become something else, something closer to disbelief. I picked up the bag. I said, "I love you. I am not coming back." And I walked out of the house that had been my entire world for 17 years, into a November night that was cold and dark and completely, terrifyingly, exactly what I had chosen. The door closed behind me. I did not look back. I had decided before I got up from that table that I would not look back, because I knew that if I saw their faces in that moment I would feel something that would make the next step harder. And the The step from the porch to the path to the street to the rest of my life needed to be taken without hesitation. So I took it. The bus left at 11 that night. I sat in the station for 4 hours with my bag between my feet and my phone in my hand, and I watched the messages arrive. My mother first, then my father, then my oldest sister who had left the house herself 3 years earlier and called me with a voice that was equal parts worry and something that sounded, underneath the worry, like recognition. The messages from my parents were what I had expected. My mother's were emotional, cycling between hurt and appeal and a particular kind of wounded confusion that came from someone who genuinely could not locate the source of what I was saying because they had never been required to see it clearly. My father's were shorter and flatter and contained, in the third message, a sentence that I have thought about many times since. He wrote, "You have broken this family." I read that sentence and I thought about Leah putting 4 children to bed at 15. I thought about Daniel's abandoned homework. I thought about Maya's eyes. I thought about all the things that had been broken long before I stood up at that table, broken quietly and invisibly in the way that things break when the people responsible for them are not paying attention. I did not respond. My cousin met me at the bus station 3 states away at 6 in the morning. She was 31, she had left our extended family circle at 22, and she had built a life that looked nothing like the one we had both come from. She handed me coffee and put my bag in the trunk of her car and drove me to her apartment without asking me to explain or justify or provide any account of myself beyond the one she had already received. She gave me the room she used as an office. She said I could stay as long as I needed. She said the only thing she asked was that I finish school. I said that was the only thing I had been asking for myself for years. She smiled. It was the first time in days that I had been in a room where the air felt like something other than pressure. The adjustment was not simple. I want to be honest about that because this story does not end with me walking out that door and immediately inhabiting a better life. The better life had to be built, and building required materials I was still in the process of acquiring. I enrolled in the local high school. I was behind in some areas and significantly ahead in others, which was the predictable result of an education that had been conducted partly in formal settings and partly in the informal school of managing a large household from childhood. A counselor at the school, a woman named Mrs. Okafor, noticed within the first 2 weeks that something more than academic adjustment was happening with me. She did not press. She made herself available. I eventually took that availability and told her enough that she was able to connect me with a therapist who worked on a sliding scale and who I began seeing every 2 weeks. Therapy was the thing I had not known I needed and could not have named if you had asked me. It was not comfortable. It did not produce immediate clarity or relief. What it produced, slowly, over months of conversations that sometimes felt like excavation, was the ability to look at what I had grown up inside without either defending it or being destroyed by it. To see my parents as people who had made choices with consequences they had never been required to fully understand. To see myself as someone who had been given responsibilities that were not mine to carry and had carried them anyway, and who had eventually put them down, and who was now in the process of learning what it felt like to carry only what actually belonged to me. My parents called for 3 months with the regularity of people who believe that continued contact will eventually produce the response they are looking for. My father's calls were short, his messages direct, focused on the obligation I had to my family and the example I was setting for my younger siblings. My mother's were longer and less structured, moving between grief and appeal and occasional anger and a particular kind of religious framing that positioned my leaving as a spiritual failure that could be corrected if I simply chose differently. I listened to every voicemail. I did not return a single call. Not because I had decided my parents were people I would never speak to again, but because I understood, with the clarity that distance and a good therapist produce, that the conversation they wanted to have was one in which I would eventually be absorbed back into the previous arrangement, and that arrangement was the thing I had left. The siblings were different. The siblings were the part of this that did not resolve into anything clean or simple. Leah called me 6 weeks after I left. She was 15 and she cried in the way of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a long time and has finally found someone to put it down in front of. I talked to her for 2 hours. I told her that what she was carrying was not hers. I told her there were people she could reach out to if things became unmanageable. I told her that what I had done was available to her too, not necessarily in the same form, not necessarily at 17, but that the life our parents had built was not a sentence. It was a situation. Situations can be changed. Daniel called a month after Leah. He was 13 and quieter about it, less tears and more questions. He wanted to know if I was okay. He wanted to know if I had enough to eat. He was 13 and asking if I had enough to eat, which told me everything about what he had absorbed about what caring for people looked like. I told him I was okay. I told him I worried about him. He said he was fine in the way people say they are fine when they are not sure they are allowed to say otherwise. Maya did not call for 4 months. When she finally called, she said she had not known what to say and had been working up to it. I told her she did not need to have anything to say. She said, after a silence, what you said at the table. About help being available. Did you mean that? I said yes. She said okay. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular and everything important, the kind of conversation that does not have a clear subject but carries an enormous amount of weight just by existing. I cried after I hung up. Not from sadness. From the specific grief of loving people you grew up alongside and understanding that your ability to help them has real limits that you did not choose and cannot remove. The announcement my mother had made that November evening produced, approximately 7 months later, a 20th child. I know this because Leah told me. A boy. I have not met him. I do not know if I will. He is real and he is alive and he is already, by the simple fact of his existence in that household, inheriting a structure that will ask more of him than it has any right to ask. I think about him sometimes. I think about who among my siblings will be assigned to him in the rotation, whether explicitly or simply through the gravity of need seeking the nearest available person. I think about what it would take to change the structure rather than simply survive it or escape it. I do not have an answer to that. The honest truth is that I escaped it, and escaping it was the only thing that was available to me at 17 with a packed bag and a bus ticket. The larger question, the question of what changes the structure itself, is one I am still working out. I finished high school. I was accepted to a state university with a financial aid package that made attendance possible. My cousin drove me to campus on the first day and helped me carry boxes into a dorm room that was mine alone, the first room I had ever had that was mine alone, and when she left I sat on the bed in the quiet and I stayed there for a long time. Not crying. Not thinking about anything in particular. Just sitting in the specific experience of the space that contained only my things and required nothing from me except that I exist inside it. I am in my second year now. I am studying social work, which will surprise nobody who has heard this story. Mrs. Okafor is part of why. My own history is part of why. The boy who is growing up in that house right now, 20th of 20, inheriting a structure he did not choose, is part of why. I do not know if I will be able to change anything for him specifically. I do not know if the work I am training for will reach the particular household I came from. But I understand, in a way I could not have understood from inside it, that what happened in my family was not unique. That there are variations of it in houses across the country, children carrying what LTS have declined to carry, labor distributed invisibly downward, love used as a justification for a system that love alone cannot sustain. My father sent me a message on my 18th birthday. It was brief. It said he hoped I was safe and that the door was always open. I read it and I thought about what the door opened onto and I wrote back, one sentence, I know. I hope things are different for the ones still there. He did not respond. I had not expected him to. My mother sent me a photograph on the day the baby was born. Just the photograph, no message. A tiny face, eyes closed, fists curled in the particular way of newborns who have not yet understood what world they have arrived in. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I felt things that did not arrange themselves into any clean emotion. Love and grief and anger and something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. I did not respond to that either. There was nothing to say that would have been both honest and kind, and I have learned, slowly and at real cost, that when those two things cannot coexist in a response, silence is more honest than forcing them together. I talked about the photograph in therapy the following week. My therapist asked me what I felt when I looked at it. I said I felt the weight of something I could not fix. She said that was a reasonable thing to feel. She said that some things cannot be fixed from the outside, and that knowing that is not the same as not caring. I said I knew. She said sometimes knowing is the only thing available, and it has to be enough. I am working on that. The enough part. The part where you have done what you could do, from the position you were in, with the options that were available, and you accept that the rest is not yours to carry. I set the bags down at 17 and I have been learning, slowly and imperfectly, not to pick them back up just because the weight of them is still familiar. The night I walked out of that house I was cold and terrified and more certain than I had ever been about anything. I did not know what was coming. I did not know about Mrs. Okafor or therapy or the dorm room that would one day be quiet in exactly the right way. I did not know who I was going to become or what it was going to cost to become her. I just knew that the door was behind me and I was not going back through it. And that for the first time in 17 years, the only person I was responsible for walking forward was me. That knowledge, simple as it sounds, was the most extraordinary thing I had ever felt. Some people are handed their freedom. Some people have to pack it in a bag and carry it out the door themselves, in the dark, on a Thursday in November, while the people who were supposed to give it to them are still sitting at the table wondering what just happened. I carried mine. And I am still carrying it. That is the difference.